So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with an absolute pleasure that I'm welcoming our guest tonight and friend of the skeptical community. Please join me in a very warm welcome to the one and only Professor David Nutt.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invite, actually. It all came back to me. The last time I was in here, 1969. And we were trying to stop Hans Eysenck talking about the inheritance of intelligence. It was a long time ago. We kind of won that battle, but actually this is the battle for the reforming the drug laws is one we haven't yet won, but no doubt in time we will. So it's great to be here. It's great to be back. It's nice that you turned on the cold air for me, just to remind me what it used to be like to be living in Cambridge. And it's good to have so many of you here. You've already heard that I'm a friend of the Skeptics. You may not know why I'm a friend of the Skeptics. I became a friend of the Skeptics when this happened. So this was nearly 10 years, 9.5 years ago now. This is when I was sacked as the government's chief drugs advisor. And you can see the hand of the Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, over my mouth trying to shut me up. That was a really stupid thing to think he could do. And you can see the Book of Cannabis falling from my hand. And the scales of justice sum up the debate rather neatly, because they show beer and fags weighing down British society more than those strange green chemicals and the plastic bags on the other side. And at the time, I was simply telling the government that the evidence suggested, well, it didn't suggest, it almost proved, that certainly tobacco and cigarettes were the most harmful drugs in the UK in terms of population harm. And the hysteria that they were generating around cannabis and around synthetics was, to a large extent, a smokescreen to avoid the government confronting the real challenge, which was actually alcohol and tobacco. And that was definitely not a message that the government wanted to hear, because they were getting ready for an election and they wanted to appease the newspapers such as the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph. And so they tried to shut me up and they sacked me. And that was on a Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock or so on a Friday afternoon. And the following Thursday, I was invited to talk at this organization called the Skeptics in the pub. And I spoke at the one which is just down the road, one of the first ones just down the road from Parliament. And that gave me the voice. And since then, it's been very difficult to shut me up. So I apologize if you get bored, but I'll try to be quick. Okay, so it was a dangerous topic. I got sacked. Next slide, please. But as I said, I knew I was right. And in fact, the proof I was right came with this statement from President Obama. It's about 5 years ago now. A remarkable statement, the first time an American president had ever told the truth about drugs. But a really important statement, because it set the tone for the international discussion, particularly around cannabis. What Obama was saying was that the feds, the Drug Enforcement Agency, should stop destroying pharmacies that were making cannabis medicines available. At that time, 5 years ago, 200 million Americans had access to medical marijuana. Not a single Brit had at that time, and I think only 7 have today, but we'll come back to that. But the feds were still taking the federal line, because cannabis is still illegal under federal law in America. But it is a medicine, and the feds were destroying pharmacies, and Obama said, we've got to stop doing this. This is insane, waging a war on pharmacies, on sick people, simply to kind of perpetuate this myth that cannabis is a dangerous drug is wrong. And he said cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, and of course he was right. I presume he'd read my papers, but he didn't cite them in the talk. But anyway, it changed everything, because it's actually effectively changed the WHO, and the WHO now is no longer constrained by the Americans to lie about cannabis, and it's hopefully given us enough courage to do what we should do in this country, which is to make cannabis at least legal as a medicine. The next slide, please. So, how do we know that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol? Is it just a long pause? Are you trying to... Well, let me tell you about the talk I gave in Leicester. where the slide projector crashed every 25 seconds. So we're getting close to this, aren't we? Okay, so we've got a little delay here. All right, so how do we know this? Well, about 10 years ago, while I was still acceptable to the UK government, I persuaded the Medical Research Council to support, with the Home Office, an assessment, of the harms of drugs. And we developed a project. The way we did this was to create an expert committee of about 30 people. These were actually the members of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs at the time. We took them away to a retreat, locked them up for the weekend, and told them to write down every harm of any drug they could think of and stick them on a Post-it. And then we stuck the Post-its around the wall of this conference venue. And there were about 3,000 Post-its. And then we collated them all into separate clusters. Now, it isn't just me, no. Usually it's Special Branch, actually, kind of trying to log in. But we collated them into these clusters, and it turned out that there were 16 ways in which drugs can harm you. You can see them here. There are 9 harms to the users of drugs and 7 harms to society. And then we set about ranking a whole series of drugs according to these 16 variables. So we essentially then had another conference, similar experts, spent 2 days ranking all the drugs according to those 16 parameters of harm, weighting all the parameters of harm. And then out came, through the computer program called HighView, this result. And you can see, it was a surprise to me, and I think to most of us, because it's such a complicated process, as you can imagine, with so many variables, that alcohol came out as the most harmful drug in the UK. And the reason for that is the huge size of the red bar. The red bar is the harm that alcohol does to society, to other people, way more than any other drug. And that's, of course, because alcohol is just so widely used. About 85% of the adult population in Britain use alcohol. It's not the most harmful drug to the user. That's to the right of alcohol. You can see there. You can see crack and crystal and heroin. But certainly, overall, alcohol is pretty harmful. And in terms of population terms, it's the most harmful drug of all. And the drugs that the media like to get hysterical about are down at the right-hand side of that curve. Drugs like ecstasy and magic mushrooms, cat, etc. And this was obviously seen as a very important paper. It got published in The Lancet, which is the leading medical journal in the world. And the next slide, please. One thing that came out of this analysis was that there was actually no correlation whatsoever with the UK Misuse of Drugs Act or the UN Conventions on Drugs. So there's no relationship between drug harms and how we control them, which is worrying. Next slide, please. Because at the very least, it means that these laws are immoral because they're supposed to be based on evidence. They're actually probably illegal, at least the Misuse of Drugs Act in Britain is, and several times we've approached senior lawyers about taking the government to judicial review because perpetuating an act which is in breach of its own definitions is probably illegal, but lawyers always point out it's very expensive to take on a government, and if you win, they'll just change the law anyway, so why bother? So we haven't. The next slide, please. But there are very serious implications for having laws which are not based on evidence, and many of the drugs which are illegal are potentially hugely useful and powerful treatments. Like cannabis, you probably know a bit about now, but there's good evidence for treating pain, sleep, spasticity, cancer, PTSD. Ecstasy, MDMA, was and is being developed a little bit now for PTSD, may work in Parkinson's disease. Magic mushrooms for depression, OCD, cluster headaches, LSD for terminal illness and addiction. So these banned drugs actually were medicines, and we've lost the ability to use them. And many, many patients have suffered as a result. And just remember mephedrone, MCAT, meow, meow, which I'll come back to at the end. Next slide. Working with these drugs is almost impossible because they are controlled in what's called Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 is a kind of double whammy. It's like putting you in a prison and then throwing away the key and then forgetting that there ever was a key. because Schedule 1 says basically they have no medical use, which is clearly is false, because they were medicines. And they're too dangerous to use, which of course is absurd, particularly for drugs like cannabis, ecstasy, and psychedelics. Next slide, please. You don't confront the realities of these international excesses in this country, but around the world, many people suffer. So over half the world's population, several billion people, because that's the population of China and India, plus Malaysia and Indonesia, they're denied access to strong painkillers because their governments decide it's simpler to comply with the UN conventions by not making the drugs available as medicines at all. That way they haven't got to have regulations, that way they haven't got to ensure that the hospitals keep them under safe custody, etc. In most countries, it's up to 20 now, but 20 of the 225 countries in the world, cannabis is still illegal. Psychedelics are not actually medicines anywhere in the world. MDMA is banned in most of the world. And research on these drugs, because they're Schedule 1 drugs, is almost non-existent. And this creates a kind of perpetuating circle. No one does any research, so people continue to believe that these drugs have no value. Next slide. Now, when you talk to the international regulators, drug regulators, and you talk to lawyers, they say, well, the UN conventions and the Misuse of Drugs Act, they don't say you can't work on these drugs. They just say you've got to apply appropriate controls. But when you try to work with these drugs, the appropriate controls are so intense that it's actually like being in a Kafka play. You don't know what the words mean. You don't know, nor do the people you're talking to, and no one has any clue where the entrance or the exit is. And this kind of proves it. So here you see a really nice piece of data published just a year or so ago now. And it looks at the number of publications, which is the best evidence we have of scientific interest, in LSD in blue and magic mushroom juice, psilocybin, in red. And you can see LSD was made available as a research tool in the early 1950s, and there was an explosion of research. The US government funded 140 separate studies with LSD, and that's why there was a massive increase. Each of those spikes is a year on year, so you're seeing each year the number of papers. So right at the peak of research in 1967, 68, over 200 papers a year were published on LSD, and about 30 or 40 on psilocybin. By that time, psilocybin was an approved medicine in some countries. And then they were banned. And you can see what happened. There were a few years, people carried on publishing because they had data. But since that arrow, there's never been a single grant funded by anyone in the world to study LSD as a medicine. And eventually, publications really disappeared. And for 2 years, psilocybin, there was not a single publication in the world on psilocybin. And that proves that this is the kind of censorship. Yes, you can work on them if you comply with regulations which are impossible to comply with, so people don't. And even if you can comply with the regulations, you won't ever get any funding to do it, so it's a double whammy. Next slide, please. If you're interested in the politics and the lost opportunities, there are a couple of papers I've written. The top one is a very detailed one looking at the history of the controls. The bottom one in PLOS Biology is a freebie. It's easier if you want to read that. That's a good one to give to anyone that doubts what you tell them when you tell them you've come to hear me. And I was confronting you with the challenges of doing research for these drugs. The next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. It's me. I'm definitely me. Thank you. Now, I would argue, and I'm happy to discuss this later if you want, I believe this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. In terms of the censorship of science and the censorship of medical research, there really has never been anything that remotely gets to a 50-plus year censorship of research on a whole range of compounds which have huge medical potential, also huge neuroscience interest. There's only one possible exception. There's only one other period of censorship which could remotely be considered as bad as the censorship of these drugs. And that's on the next slide. And that's in 1616 when the Catholic Church banned the telescope. Now, they did that for exactly the same reason as we've banned research on drugs, because they did not want people to know the truth. They didn't want people to know that Copernicus had worked it out, that the Earth was not the center of the universe. The sun was. And they tried to insist that the world didn't know the truth about the Earth by banning the writings of Copernicus and burning Bruno at the stake because he tried to tell people, and giving Galileo that interesting choice, to burn or recant, and he recanted. That ban lasted 150 years. The ban on working with cannabis has lasted over 50 years, and it's just beginning to be eroded. The ban on psychedelics is still extant. And when you think of the area under the curve of research in the last 50 years compared with the very small number of people who were doing astronomy research back in the 1600s, you realize, the opportunities lost by these bans are just way greater than the ban of the church in terms of Copernicus. And of course, the Catholic Church's ban only applied to Catholic countries, and the Northern Europeans, or Protestant countries, could continue to study the stars with impunity, whereas the ban on psychotropic drugs is now it exists in over 200 countries in the world. Next slide. You're probably all aware of the fact that we managed to overturn the hegemony of the church in terms of telling us what science was through this Age of Enlightenment. It's the great intellectual movement which in fact really defines Western society and the principles on which we work today. And the next slide. You'd think that because it was so powerful then and it affected such enormous changes and also defined the way in which universities like this work, you'd expect that those principles of scientific knowledge would actually underpin everything we do. But it doesn't. Next slide. And here are just a few images. I think one of them went to this place, didn't he? I'm not sure. And maybe he was both. I'm not actually. Anyway, carry on. But the one I want to I want to point out the quote from Voltaire, he gave the narrative of the Enlightenment, and he saw through his rather cynical but wise eyes the problems of changing society. And he gave this wonderful quote: "Prejudices are what fools use for reason." And I would say that all the debate we've had in the last 100 years about drugs in the Western world has been based on prejudice, not reason. And I'm going to give you some examples why I say that. Next slide. So let's look at medical cannabis. Cannabis was a medicine in Britain until 1971. We had been pressurized since 1960 by the US to change our laws. The Americans insisted that our laws were the same as their laws, and eventually they've won. Every single law in this country around drugs has been made at the behest of the Americans, with the exception of the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act. And after 10 years of being berated for keeping cannabis as a medicine, we eventually took it out of the pharmacopoeia in 1971. The reason the Americans wanted it not to be a medicine, because they believed that if doctors didn't prescribe it, people would stop using it recreationally. A kind of surreal concept, which they'd already shown failed completely when they banned heroin in 1938 and discovered they had an epidemic of use in the 50s and 60s. But anyway, it's difficult for Americans to learn, so they pushed us. And the paradox is that it was a medicine. 100 years ago, the most powerful woman in the world, probably the most powerful woman the world's ever seen, Queen Victoria, was quite happy to be prescribed cannabis medicine. She used it for period pains and pains of childbirth. But it's now so different. Next slide, please. And this is what we're confronted with. We were until November the 1st last year. So since 1971, we have been waging a war on medical cannabis. And here's an example. This is one of many examples of people who've written to me saying, can I help them? Because this is what happens. So here you have a teacher in her 50s. She's got multiple sclerosis. She's in a wheelchair. The only relief she gets from cannabis, 3 times the police have gone in on a dawn raid and knocked her door down to prosecute her for having cannabis. Now, it's not as if she can jump out the window and run away because she's in a wheelchair. So if they just pressed the bell, she'd have let them in. Why do they smash the door down? Well, the reasons are actually because they quite enjoy the violence. It happens early in the morning, so they get overtime, and they get to dress up as paramilitary. So there's a sort of, the war on drugs encourages this kind of violence. And as a taxpayer, I find it really obscene that my tax money is used to encourage that kind of unnecessary behavior. If she's convicted again, she'll go to prison. And I don't believe in Scotland there's a single prison that's actually wheelchair compliant. So it's very difficult for her, because if the police were to prosecute her again, she would be convicted. And she still used cannabis because it's the only thing that gives her relief. And that is an absurd example of how we have policed in the individuals using a drug like cannabis. Next slide. So why are these drugs? Why do we care about what drugs people use? Why is there such hysteria about these drugs? Next slide. And there are really 4 drivers to this, and these drivers go back a long time. They go back to the 19th century with the Puritan movement that underpinned temperance, the rise of the opposition to any kind of drug, including alcohol. In the late 1800s, you could go down to your corner shop and you could buy tincture of cannabis or tincture of heroin or tincture of cocaine, or you could buy stout, and you could have pretty much any drug you wanted. And over the last 150 years, the drinks industry has managed to eliminate all competition, so now you can only go and get booze. There's also political expediency, which I'll talk about. There's the competing interests. The alcohol industry has been very successful in supporting the elimination of other drugs. And the pharmaceutical companies also have a part to play. As soon as they worked out you could get pure compounds from the plant products, morphine from opium, cocaine from the coca plant, and you could patent them, they started to argue in favor of refined pharmaceuticals and against the plant products. So those 2 industries managed to eliminate the competition from plants. But the biggest problem actually came with this man, Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was appointed in the 1920s to combat the organized crime which arose after the Americans prohibited alcohol. That led to a massive amount of illegal use. The illegal use was so prevalent that every American policeman was corrupted. Every policeman was bought by the speakeasies and by the drink runners. So they had to create a special army, the Untouchables, which now turned into the Drug Enforcement Agency. And they made Harry Anslinger the head of that. And he was the second most famous man in America. And in 1932, when he realized they were going to stop banning alcohol was going to become legal again, he was faced with a real challenge. He was going from hero to zero in the space of the time it takes to put an act through the Senate. And he didn't want to lose his position, and he didn't want to lose his 35,000 men's jobs. So he hastily created another scare. It wasn't the mafia, it was cannabis. And he created hysteria about cannabis. He renamed cannabis marijuana, so he could then terrify the American people that Mexicans were coming across the border, stoned, destroying American society. So it's interesting. The narrative hasn't changed, has it really, in the last 80 years? But he managed to keep the DEA working, and the DEA has created work for itself ever since. It's been hugely efficient. The next slide. But things got particularly bad under Nixon. And this is a statement from John Ehrlichman, his senior advisor. Nixon, in his 1968 re-election campaign, was feeling the heat. Vietnam was going badly. He thought he was going to lose. And Ehrlichman says, our campaign had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. I mean, I bet they thought about it, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes. We could break up their meetings and vilify them night after night on the evening news. A fantastic campaign. So he went from potentially losing the election to winning every state except Maine. So Nixon was re-elected based on this fear that they created around drugs. The next slide. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. It was simply created as a political solution to the possibility of not getting re-elected. And the truth is, all our governments know they're lying as well. But we have continued to slavishly follow the US position, which is actually the UN position. Next slide. And one of these is a Cambridge person, by the way. You can work it out. Charles Darwin said, "False facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long." And in a more psychologically aware, Mark Twain said, "How easy it is to make people believe a lie and how hard it is to undo that." And this is a huge problem. And we still have this problem today. Cannabis was made a legal medicine on the 1st of November. Only 7 prescriptions have been written because doctors don't want to believe that they have been lied to for the last 40 years, that it doesn't have any medical value. Next slide. So just a few more words about cannabis. This is the man that sacked me, Alan Johnson. There's me. I'm the guy with the moustache and the spliff there. And the other people, by the way, the other scientists on the council who resigned when I was sacked because they thought it was unjust. Next slide. Cannabis is a fascinating drug because in my lifetime we have seen this amazing transformation in its use. So back in 1971, when I was an undergraduate here, about 500,000 British people had used cannabis. And that increased over the next 40 years to about 10 million. So you had a 20-fold increase in the number of cannabis users. That probably equates to something like a 100-fold increase in the amount of cannabis used. If you think about the changing strength, it's probably 200 to 300 times increase in the amount of THC used. If cannabis was a real problem, you think that massive increase in use would have actually translated into some evidence of harms, wouldn't you? But it hasn't. But we have to keep cannabis illegal. So how do we justify that? The next slide. Well, it's a challenge keeping cannabis illegal because when you compare its harm to other drugs, it doesn't really have any. So on the left-hand side, you see tobacco, 80,000 deaths a year. That's what economists call good deaths because smokers pay a lot of tax and they die before they can draw their pensions. But alcohol is about 28,000 or so a year now. Opiates, 1,000 or so. And cannabis, next slide. Yeah, cannabis, well, I don't know, 2 or 3 deaths a year. You know, people aren't dying of cannabis. So why is there hysteria over cannabis? Next slide. Well, it's because it's politically expedient. And keeping cannabis illegal was a way in which the Brown government managed to show it was hard on drugs and to stand up against the Cameron Tories, who then carried on being hard on drugs when they got into power. And it's only public pressure with dying children in the last year that's changed it. But we have been fighting back. This is an article I wrote in the Pharmaceutical Journal a few years ago, which led to a debate in the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and it was won. Pharmacists want medical cannabis. So at least we've got the beginnings of the dawn rising. The next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. One of the other interesting things about medical cannabis is that we're seeing that when people have access to a drug which doesn't kill you, they're less likely to die. America, last year, 70,000 Americans died of opiate overdose. That's more in 1 year than died in the whole of the Vietnam War. And one of the reasons that Americans are endorsing medical cannabis so enthusiastically is it's probably as good as opiates for pain control and chronic pain, and it doesn't kill you in overdose. And we're also seeing reductions in death on the roads from alcohol because people are less likely to drive when drunk. Next slide. And it's an old medicine. It's probably the oldest medicine. It's even got a Chinese character for it, so it must be a real medicine. And it's been around for 3,000 or 4,000 years. The next slide, please. The fascinating thing about the politics of cannabis is that in 1934, it was defined by the League of Nations as having no medical value. And in 2016, I went to the WHO and I presented an update that was done through drug science experts on the medical value of cannabis, because the WHO had not reviewed the medical value of cannabis ever. The WHO was relying on the 1934 report that it had no medical value. And when we went to give them the up-to-date report, 2016, we asked to see the old report. And they said they couldn't show it to us because it had been lost. It's kind of weird, isn't it, that you actually defend a position that a drug had no value without even knowing what the evidence of that was. But they did it because the UN and the US did not want the rules to be revised. It was a truly outrageous decision. But now it's beginning to move. Next slide, please. What about MDMA, ecstasy? MDMA is the pure medicine of MDMA. MDMA is an interesting compound. It was widely used in psychotherapy back in the 1970s and 80s. Before it hit the rave scene, it was called empathy. And no one cared about people using empathy. But as soon as the name was changed to ecstasy and young people started using it, the press got hysterical and it got banned. And I still say, if we kept its name as empathy, it would still be legal today. But its name was changed to encourage young people to use it. But it is a medicine. The next slide, please. And it's a particularly useful medicine in relation to war trauma. And we're now in this fascinating position where a lot of people, a lot of soldiers suffer from PTSD. Many, of course, many other people, many Rwandans, and maybe the majority of Syrians have got PTSD. And the next slide. But we also have this challenge to the military, which is now that military people are more likely to kill themselves than being killed by the enemy. We've kind of inverted the principles of war, because people who are fighting these wars, they don't really know why they're fighting them. They rarely see the enemy. They see their mates blown up or have bits chopped off by bombs, and then they come home and then they either kill themselves or they kill other people. So how can we deal with PTSD, which is maybe the great problem going to become the great problem of our time? The next slide. Next slide, please. It shows a fascinating study. It's quite old now, 6-7 years old, and it shows a study from these psychotherapists in America called the Mithoffers, who took people with treatment-resistant PTSD. They failed on 2 treatments. They gave them two separate sessions, 2 weeks apart, MDMA therapeutic sessions, 2 trips on the MDMA, and they found that there was a powerful improvement, that they became much less affected by their PTSD. They became, in many ways, cured, and this effect lasted for years. Now they've gone up for 7 years in that cohort. So this is a revolution in the treatment of people with this chronic traumatic disorder. Next slide. Yeah, next slide, please. But how does it work? Actually, there's been virtually no research on MDMA because people won't fund it, because it's an illegal drug and a recreational drug. And I remember once going to the Wellcome Trust saying, we'd like to study MDMA. And they said, why? And they said, well, because 1 million people who use it every weekend, and we ought to know what it does. And they said, we can't do that because that would be encouraging use. The reputational risk, they said, would be too great to the Wellcome Trust name. If we were to research this drug, we would get vilified by the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, etc. And so, in fact, the first detailed imaging study of MDMA was done by us, funded by Channel 4. It was kind of absurd, but they wanted people to watch the program. They wanted people to know they were doing something challenging, and they did. That's John Snow with a 100 milligram tablet of MDMA. And the next slide. We were particularly interested in the changes in the brain that this drug might produce, but we, at the same time, measured alterations in the affect in terms of people's memories, we asked them to remember some good memories and some bad memories, and we found on the left-hand side that, as you might predict, MDMA enhances good memories, but it also dampened down bad memories. And we believe this is why it's useful therapeutically, because it helps people relive the trauma, but without the extreme emergence of emotions which make people struggle to overcome and deal with the trauma. Next slide. And we were able to show that MDMA, in fact, had a profound effect on the deep structures in the brain. Those blue areas of the brain there are the areas of the brain where MDMA works. They're blue because MDMA dampens down activity in the brain, doesn't increase it. And it dampens down in areas of the brain which are essential for regulating memory and emotion, the hippocampus and amygdala. So now we've got a rationale for why PTSD might work. Why MDMA might work in PTSD, because it dampens down those centers which become overwhelmed when people relive the trauma. Next slide. And then finally, I want to tell you about magic mushroom, psilocybin. So there's the Liberty Cap mushroom. We decided in fact, 10 years ago, last weekend, 6 days ago, 10 years ago, we gave the first ever dose of psilocybin to someone in a brain scanner. And psilocybin is the active ingredient of magic mushroom juice. It works on serotonin receptors. And we were the first people to scan what it does in the brain. The next slide. And we kind of expected that this hallucinogenic psychedelic experience, people seeing all sorts of colored lights and wandering through space and meeting interesting people, would actually turn on parts of the brain, but it doesn't. It didn't, in fact. It just turned off parts of the brain. It turned off parts of the brain which essentially control your sense of consciousness. But it also turned off that part of the brain which you see in the yellow circle there. And that's the part of the brain which we know drives depression. And we know that many treatments of depression, in fact, probably all treatments of depression, suppress activity in that part of the brain. And based on that observation and the fact that after having psilocybin, people often feel a sense of well-being. They feel more in tune with the world. Next slide, please. We were able to get a grant the first and only grant we've ever gotten from the government, to study the effects of psilocybin in depression. And we got this because depression is such a major problem, and our treatments aren't very good. And to my surprise, we got the grant, but that was the easy bit. It took us 3 iterations at the ethics committee to get permission to do this. And in the end, they said we couldn't do a controlled trial because it was too dangerous. And I said, well, again, at least 1 million people a year in Britain are using psilocybin. No one's dying. How can it be that dangerous? And they said, but you never know. It might be depressed people might be different. And I thought, well, probably some of those people are depressed. But anyway, we had to concede. We couldn't do a proper trial. We had to just do a safety study. They said you've got to give 1 dose to 12 people, follow them up for 6 months, and if none of them die, then you could actually do a proper study. Okay. But faced with that or nothing, we took that. And then, that was the easy bit. And again, it took 30 months to get the drug supply. An illegal drug, only made in one place in the world, to the standards we could use. And then all the problems of getting import licenses, export licenses, licenses to hold, license. It's a bureaucrat's dream. It took 30 months, and then 2 months to get the regulator approval. And it ended up costing about £1,500 per dose, which is, well, thank you for those taxpayers who paid for that, because I'm really, but since they grow in my garden, I could have cut that down by quite a lot. And when you say to the Home Office, well, why do I need a special police check? Why do I need a special safe? Why do I need a camera to show that when I'm going in and taking this out, I'm not sniffing it? Why do I need all this? When I can write a prescription for heroin myself and go and have something. And they say, oh, well, you could be a drug dealer. We have to protect the public from you scientists. To which my reply was, well, I know I work in Hammersmith, but not even in Chelsea am I going to get £1,500 a dose. I promise you. Next slide. But the study turned out to be remarkable, because the good thing is no one died, and the even better thing is that most people got better. So these are people who had failed on at least two, some had failed on over 10 different antidepressants. They'd all failed on CBT. And you see, the first 12 all got better within a week of the single trip. Some had gone into that yellow band, which is, they'd recovered. They didn't have depression anymore. And some people stayed well for months, and others, the depression crept back. But this was a truly remarkable find, a single treatment producing enduring changes in people who've been resistant to other treatments. I mean, it's a remarkable finding. And next slide, please. Next slide. Hello. It was so remarkable that it's actually encouraged a whole group of other people to start doing this kind of work. Now, there have subsequently been 2 studies using psilocybin to help people come to terms with terminal diagnoses. And now there's a multi-center trial starting in Europe of psilocybin for depression, resistant depression. And the European Medicines Agency has told them that if they've given it what's called breakthrough status, if it works, it could be a medicine in a few years. They only need to do 1 major study to show it works. The next slide, please. And in fact, we should be encouraging now many people to revisit the idea of illegal drugs, because the evidence in disorders like addiction is very strong. So this is a meta-analysis of the 6 trials that were conducted with LSD back in the 50s and 60s when it was legal. And the next slide shows that it has the effect size is as good as anything we have today. And now people are beginning to try to look at psychedelics. So psilocybin has now been shown to have powerful effects in helping people stop smoking. A small study in helping people stop drinking. Ketamine is now being developed as a treatment for alcoholism and heroin dependence. And also there's a small study we're conducting using MDMA to help people stop drinking. We're looking at people who drink to suppress their PTSD. And we're trying to get rid of the trauma memories so that they don't need to drink. Well, that's it. That's all there is in 50 years. And what a waste. I've estimated that since these drugs were banned in 1967, probably 100 million people worldwide have died prematurely from alcohol dependence. And if only 10% of them were cured with a psychedelic, that would be 10 million lives saved. That's the same number who probably died from malaria. But why don't we use it? We don't use it because we've got to protect the world from the horrors of LSD, even though when you look to see what those horrors are, we don't know if there are any. So this is truly an outrageous censorship of medicine. Next slide. Why do we continue to pursue this? And I tell you, we do, because we've had these debates with drugs ministers. Our current drugs minister still believes this. That if you have medical use, it'll encourage recreational use. And I say that's absurd. We have a greater proportion of our population using cannabis than countries where it's legal. And that's not surprising, because the black market is actually the best market. Next slide. We don't see that. We don't see displacement from medical use for cannabis. Heroin's been a medicine in this country. We don't see. There's almost no displacement of medical heroin to the black market. I mean, yeah, it's a false argument. Next slide. And it gives the wrong message, they say. If you give the wrong, and I really struggle with this idea that actually lying is the right message. How can the truth ever be the wrong message? Well, the next slide sums it up. Next slide. Because we're waging a war. And when we're waging a war, reason is treason. And that's the problem. The war on drugs has actually distorted people's ability to not just to say the truth, but also to think the truth. Next slide. And there are many other interesting ways we could progress innovation and treatment in medicine if we were to really use science. One of them is Britain's led the world in, vaping. Vaping is a brilliant way of reducing the harms of tobacco. We should also endorse snus, Swedish safe oral tobacco, which is probably as safe, if not maybe even safer than vaping. But we don't do that because the tobacco companies won't let us. They control access of other tobacco products to this country. We could replace alcohol. Modern neuroscience would allow us to replace alcohol with something I call Alcarel. Some of you may have read about it. It was in The Guardian this morning. There was an article on our Alcarel. Alcarel is to alcohol what aspartame or Canderel is to sugar. It gives you the pleasure, but without the harms. In Britain, though, we have no idea whether it's legal, because we have an act called the Psychoactive Substances Act, which says that anything that works on your brain is illegal, unless it is alcohol. And that's actually not a very encouraging message to give to investors. So we're currently exploring the possibility of developing these other countries where they would at least endorse and welcome a safer alcohol. Next slide. And here's a remarkable natural experiment I told you to remember mephedrone, MCAT, meow meow. Some of you may even have used it back in the old days, back in the 2000s. These graphs show the number of deaths per million people in this country. The top black line is cocaine, and the lower red line is amphetamine. And you can see, you go back to the early 90s, year on year, more and more deaths from cocaine and amphetamine, until the dotted line about 2008. And then they fell. And they fell because people switched to mephedrone. Mephedrone was a legal cathinone, a legal stimulant, a weak stimulant. And because it was legal, you could order it, people would deliver it, you didn't get arrested for taking it. And that shows the rationality of the drug-using public. Because most people don't want to die after they use their drugs. They actually want the drug that's just safe and legal. And you can see the switch from cocaine, particularly, also amphetamines, to mephedrone, led to a very significant fall. There were probably 300 or 400 people still alive today who would not have been alive if they carried on using cocaine or amphetamine. But the 2010 election was coming on us. The Home Secretary had to appease the sun, and mephedrone was banned. And you can see the dotted line, the second line, 2010, it was banned. And what happened? Well, if everything's illegal, people just switch back to the better drug. Cocaine's undoubtedly a better drug. And if everything's illegal, you go back to cocaine. And you see cocaine deaths have now risen and risen to the highest they've ever been. But that particular graph shows that if you give people access to something that's less harmful, and it's legal, they will use it. People are rational. I don't think you need really any better evidence that safer drugs save lives. The next slide. And then finally, I want to finish, because this is a very challenging area. Why do we control drugs at all? Well, I think most of us would argue there are some drugs, that are so toxic, you wouldn't want them floating around. You don't want botulinum toxin being put into kids' food, do you? No, you really want to control very toxic substances. So there's got to be some criteria, but what should they be? The next slide. Well, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to make sure that the decision-making process is led by experts who don't have an interest, unlike the drinks industry, which has a very profound interest in trying to persuade people that alcohol is not a drug. Next slide. I've always argued that if any country which allows the advertising and sale of alcohol should allow access to drugs which are less harmful than alcohol. I mean, it seems to me that is a morally necessary position. I wrote this paper quite a few years ago now, 10, 15 years ago. But ecstasy is less harmful than alcohol, ethanol. So I think you have to think very carefully about why you would endorse the sole use of alcohol in present society. Next slide. And I've shown you this graph already. We can estimate the harms of different drugs to the user, and we do that quite effectively. And there are plenty of drugs which are less harmful to the user. The size of the blue bar is less than that for alcohol. And basically, anything from tobacco downwards. Next slide. Next slide, please. And I would contest that we should certainly have a public debate about making drugs which are less harmful to the user than alcohol available in controlled places like pharmacies. Next slide. And then there's also the question of policy. Can we assess policy, in a way which is kind of free from politics? Can we escape this terrible treadmill of politics driving drug policy? And a few years ago, we were approached by a couple of Norwegians who had funding from their Norwegian Research Council to try to think about a way to do this. Now, Norway is a fascinating country. Norway is the richest country in the world. Money per capita, the richest country in the world. And yet its death rates from heroin are greater than Scotland. And there are people in Norway who believe that's because they have the wrong policies, and I certainly agree with them. So they're looking to change their drug policy, but they didn't also change their drug policies based on political whim. They wanted to find out how they should change their policies. And they funded us to do a research. And this time it was looking at the benefits of policies as opposed to the harms of drugs. And that turned out to be an even more complicated thing to do. The next slide. Because it turns out there are 27 separate variables that policy can influence. And they range in these different clusters: health, social, political, public, crime, economic, and cost. So that's a huge number to define, which you have to do to start with, and then to scale different drugs across those 27 different parameters. If it turned out we could only redo it for 3 drugs, because it takes about half a day to do each drug. And the next slide. And we decided to look at 4 policies. Completely free market, which is an extreme version of what we have for alcohol today. State control, decriminalization, and complete prohibition. And we defined each of those in that particular graph there. The next slide. And then we assessed these 4 policies against these 27 different policy outcomes. And here, up is better, not worse. So the taller the bar, the greater the benefit to society. And you can see that for cannabis, and actually the same was true for alcohol, that state control clearly is the best policy. It's better than the free market. It's a lot better than decriminalization to the right. And it's massively better from that tiny little bar, which is absolute prohibition. So this is the first attempt to really apply what you might call economic or social science to decision-making in relation to policies. And we would argue that that is the right policy to introduce for cannabis in Norway and in Britain and in other countries in the world. And in fact, Uruguay has introduced that policy. It has state control, state monopoly of cannabis. Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to finish now with just a couple of quotes. This one from George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And I imagine most of you probably came here thinking I was probably right, but at least you've got some more evidence to go and argue with your parents and grandparents. Try to get them to change their mind. That's much harder than changing your minds. But we should change our minds, because certainly even your grandparents will benefit from having some of the drugs that are currently illegal, especially when they're facing death. And the next slide, the last slide. So when I started working for the government, it was about 1999. I knew we didn't have a constitution, but I thought we had principles. And I actually thought these were the principles on which British society, and particularly the British decision-making in relation to policies, were built. In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others. I thought that's what we did. In the 9 years I worked in the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, I realized that was exactly what we did not do. And it was when I protested that I got sacked. But I'm glad I did, because I probably wouldn't be here speaking to you if I hadn't been sacked. And you probably wouldn't be interested in what I was saying either. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Hi. Oh, it's working. Thank you very much for the really fascinating talk. My question is, what's next in terms of changing policy? Is it a case of trying to persuade politicians? Is it a case of waiting for the next generation of people to come through, changing public perception on drugs? What do you think is next?
Yeah, I mean, it's with great regret that I sit here as a child of the 60s, having seen that our generation was unable to change anything. In fact, we made it worse. So I don't know. So that you can't rely. The first thing to say is don't be complacent. Don't assume things are going to happen just because they should or it's logical that they should. What we have seen with cannabis is the pressure from the mothers. Mothers taking their children to another country for a year in order to get proper treatment, and then being denied that treatment when they've come back here. So it's taken huge courage from mothers to get medical cannabis made available. I think what we have to do is we have to probably use the same approach. It's wrong that any of the treatments which were medicines are not medicines. So I think patient groups and relatives of patients should be campaigning strongly to get the laws changed to free drugs. Medicine should never be taken out of the pharmacopoeia by politicians. So we should campaign to get the drugs that were medicines back as medicines. And the other thing is really, but to keep the debate going, challenge the prejudice. But that's something you've all got to do. Hopefully I've given most of you some ammunition. So when you see people talking rubbish about drugs, you can just say, but that's not right. And then, buy the book and give it to them, right?
Hi, thanks so much for the great talk. My question is about cannabis.
Yes.
So when you discussed cannabis and its potential harms, you were talking about deaths. And that seems to me a bit of maybe a distraction, because I don't think the criticism of cannabis is really about death. It's more about its relationship with psychosis. So I was wondering why that was missing in your talk, and what do you think about the relationship between cannabis and psychosis?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, a lot was missing from my talk. Because I wanted to give you a chance to ask questions, but the point I was making is that typically banning a drug starts with it killing people. And if it doesn't kill people, then that really does challenge politicians. So then they have to hunt around for other reasons. So cannabis was made illegal because, as I explained, the Americans wanted it illegal, and no one really cared much until I suppose the 80s, and then cannabis smokers became sufficient in number to start challenging and asking the questions, why is it illegal? And the government didn't know, so we had to come up with some explanations. It couldn't say because the Americans told us so. So it said, it causes schizophrenia. And they also came up with the argument that it causes road traffic accidents. Those are the two big arguments. And then the spectre was raised, the spectre of skunk. And of course, cannabis now in the 90s and 2000s is different from the cannabis that existed back in the 60s and 70s. And the latter is true. The campaign to try to stop people smoking cannabis, which was founded on the idea that cannabis caused schizophrenia, or road traffic accidents, was actually very successful. We managed to eliminate importation, or significantly impede the importation of herbal and resin cannabis from Morocco and Lebanon. So we managed to destroy economies there. But we didn't stop people in Britain using cannabis. In fact, all they did was starting to grow their own. In fact, we made it worse. So we have seen in the last 40 years cannabis content of the active ingredient, THC, going from 5% to 15%. And now over 95% of all cannabis that is bought in Britain is super strong, over 15% THC, we call skunk. Now the problem with skunk is it makes you more psychotic. So our policy of trying to keep cannabis illegal has actually increased the harms of cannabis. It's increased the psychotomimetic effects of cannabis. It's increased the dependence liability of cannabis. It's probably increased the cognitive impairing effects of cannabis. So the policies were based on lies, but they have actually, in a sense, they fulfilled their original ambition by creating forms of cannabis which are so toxic that they are dangerous. And beyond cannabis now, we've actually got to the situation where we have synthetic cannabinoids, or spice, which we've encouraged the development of by obsessively testing prisoners for cannabis, which hangs around in their urine for a long time. So they've switched to substances which are much harder to detect and much shorter lived, which turn out to be much more dangerous. So last year, the last data we had 70 deaths, 70 deaths in prisons from spice. Never had a death in prisons from cannabis. So cannabis is pretty harmless, unless you try to stop people using it, in which case they use much more harmful forms. And then the government now can justify, or at least partly argue, that what it did was right. But in fact, what it did was exactly wrong. It created a monster which now it can now kind of fight against, and it can, to some extent, justify its position. But there is no real evidence that prohibition of cannabis does anything more than create harm.
Hi. A few years back, an NHS hospital in Glasgow, I think it was Glasgow, somewhere in Scotland, was criticised for providing free clean needles to some drug users.
Yeah.
How do you stand on that?
Well, I would supply clean drug as well as clean needles, yeah. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, the harm reduction. Yeah. Yeah. What is the purpose of a drug policy? As a doctor, and I would say as someone who kind of is humane and rational, the purpose of a drug policy is to reduce harm. So any policy which reduces harms, I would endorse. But for many people, though, drug policies are about moral stances, moral positions. And there are people who think that it's immoral to take drugs. And to those people, I say, well, alcohol's a drug. And some of them don't take alcohol. There are people who don't take any drugs, and they're ultra Puritans, they're ultra conservatives. Some don't even drink tea or coffee because they think it's contaminating their mind. They're a rarity. But the majority of people who take a moral position against drugs are perfectly happy to drink. And that is immoral. And so the argument has got to be that morality doesn't have a role in drug policy. Health and harm does. And if giving clean needles, and giving syringes and giving sodium, citric acid so they can make up their stuff, and giving them places to inject safely, reduce harm, which they all do, we should do it. And we got needle exchange. Why do we have needle exchange in this? Britain was great. The only thing that Margaret Thatcher did right was to allow needle exchange in Britain. And it was interesting because the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs went to see her, and they said, we're on the cusp of an AIDS epidemic, and intravenous drug use is going to be one of the big drivers for this. And we need to do needle exchange. And she said, Tories don't do needle exchange. And they said to her, okay, well, you've got to think about your legacy. Is your legacy going to be AIDS or needle exchange? They'll never remember the needle exchange, but they'll certainly remember you if you allow AIDS to become an epidemic here. And she, perhaps because she was a scientist at some point, said, okay, well, you're the experts. And we instigated needle exchange. We became an exemplar to the world of how to do needle exchange. And actually, we had a very low level of AIDS in our intravenous drug users. So we can do it right if we get our politicians on board.
Hi there. I was just wondering if you could elucidate the mechanism whereby you think MDMA can alter traumatic memories, as it doesn't seem to be very similar to most of the other methods that are used in that treatment.
So the way MDMA works, well, there are several things to say about this. It doesn't alter traumatic memories, but it changes the magnitude of the negative memories. It seems to reduce the negative valence, or the valence of negative memories. It enhances positive memories. How it does that is really interesting. We presume it's through serotonin release. We know that MDMA is a powerful serotonin releaser, but there are many serotonin receptors. There's 15 of them. We don't know which of those receptors is involved. I have some ideas, but there's almost no human research on MDMA. So even in animals, we don't really know which receptors mediate its euphoric or pleasurable effects. No one's ever done studies in humans. But I presume it's got something to do with the suppression of activity in the amygdala and hippocampus, so that it allows people to... The problem with PTSD is that the emotion, when you have a trauma, that you have a factual memory and an emotional memory. You remember the facts, and the emotions come with the facts. And we've all been traumatized. I mean, all of you will remember times in your life when it was very unpleasant things happened to you. And you can remember them factually, but most of you now no longer get desperately emotional. You might, if you're remembering when your mother died or your father died or something. But mostly you can talk about the facts without the emotions getting in the way. But if you have PTSD, the emotions are so powerful that they break through, and you can't engage with the facts without the emotions disrupting your life. And so the treatment is about reliving the facts and eventually suppressing or extinguishing the emotions. And that takes time. And you have to stay with the emotion sometimes for some of these therapies for hours in order to gradually extinguish them. And our feeling at present is that MDMA allows people to contain the extent of the emotions enough they can extinguish. But MDMA also does other things. It increases empathy with the therapist, so you're more likely to stay in the room because you're more trusting of the therapists that are helping you as well. And there may be other factors too. It's just unresearched. We should do more on it.
I think earlier this month in The Guardian, it was reported that one of the pharmaceutical companies was bringing a derivative of ketamine to market, like estaketamine or something like that. And so on one hand, you have a drug that's coming to market that can help people with depression, but on the other hand, it's really expensive. I guess, where do you come down on that?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in ketamine and esketamine. So ketamine is an anesthetic painkiller. It's been used for 50 years. It's called the buddy drug. Soldiers carry it, and then if they get their leg blown off or their mate gets their leg blown off, they give them a jab of ketamine because it deadens the pain. It's the only anesthetic we have that doesn't suppress respiration, so you don't need an anesthetist to give it, so you can give it on the battlefield. It's used to help to anesthetize children. In third world countries, it's really widely used because, again, they don't have gases, they don't have anesthetists. So it's been around for 50 years. We know it's pretty safe. And about 10 years ago, people were studying it to explore this psychotomimetic effect. Those of you who are taking ketamine know you go into a strange place. It's called the K-hole. It's like a different level of consciousness. It's an altered state of reality. And it's a model of psychosis. And the guy, John Crystal at Yale, noted that when people came out of the K-hole, they often were happier. A bit like when we gave people psilocybin, we noticed when they came out of the scanner, they were happier. And he said, well, maybe this is antidepressant. So they did a trial, and it was antidepressant. Ketamine can disrupt depressive thinking in severely depressed people, and the effect can last for several days. But because it's a licensed medicine, there is no commercial, you couldn't patent that, there's no commercial value in it. But it's also a tricky drug to use. It's got a lot of connotations. It's an abused drug. People get addicted to it. They get problems with bladders, etc. So Janssen Pharmaceuticals took the enantiomer, which is called esketamine, and they turned it from an injection, which is how ketamine is used, to a nasal spray. And it works if you can give people a couple of shots of esketamine up the nose twice a week, and it can help people get a better recovery from a depression which is only partially recovered from an antidepressant. But it is very expensive, and it's very expensive because the regulations we have to control access of medicines to the clinic are enormously burdensome, and it costs, typically $1 billion to get a drug to the market. So the companies have to recoup that. So we've kind of the regulatory system is a bit of a monster. It's very good at preventing things getting to the market which might harm you, but it means that there's a huge price on those which might help you. So whether it'll ever be used in Britain, whether we can afford it on the NHS, I don't know. But it may be. In time, prices tend to come down once they've recouped their investment companies. And eventually the patent will run out and then someone else will make it and it'll be cheaper.
Hi. So this past October, Canada legalized cannabis medically and recreationally. And I've wondered, has that corresponded to an increase in research that has been able to happen on cannabis as a result? And is that making its way into spheres outside of Canadian context? Or what's your knowledge about that?
Well, I hope so. I mean, cannabis is not much research. And I don't know if there's any dedicated money from the profits they're going to make on cannabis in Canada. I don't know if any of that's being dedicated to research. It should be. I mean, that's one of the great problems in the States is that 2/3 of all Americans have access to medical marijuana, but because it's illegal under the federal law, the feds won't give any money to any research. So we've had this amazing social change. We had the largest change in access to medicine in the history of the world, but the US government won't allow anyone to research. They won't fund research on it because it's illegal. It's another one of the great paradoxes. If you wait, if you're against something so much, you won't allow yourself to study important changes which can actually inform you. So hopefully there'll be more research. It should be easier to research in Canada, but whether anyone will bother, I don't know.
A sort of linked question to that. There's medical cannabis available, but it obviously hasn't gone through the normal trials that are necessary for drugs, through safety, through dosage, through all of those things which keep our drugs incredibly safe.
Yes, that's right.
And what's your view on the sanctioning of, like cannabis oils being allowed? I mean, there are certain politicians that like to waive all of those rules and just say, give that child that drug without knowing the dosage or effect.
Yes.
Isn't this a very dangerous approach?
Well, I think it's the only approach for this reason, because the cannabis plant contains many different substances that are likely to be therapeutic. So if we wait for a company to identify one and then extract it and then test it on a particular indication, each one of those studies, that process will take 15 years. And considering there might be 100 indications and there's 100 components in the plant, to actually properly evaluate each one against will never happen. It just won't happen. And it won't happen because that will consume all medical research investment in the world. But beyond that, it won't happen because people know that the plant itself works. So companies won't do that because they know if it does work, people will just go back to the plant. So you cannot pursue conventional pharmaceutical development because you cannot make money out of it. So it won't happen. No, well, is it dangerous? Cannabis has been around for 4,000 years. We know it's not harmful. So the reason why do we have and look, I've done a huge amount of research on pharmaceutical companies. I was employed by a pharmaceutical company for a number of years. I'm not anti-pharmaceuticals, but I am pro-medicine. The reason we have the modern approach to pharmaceuticals is largely because that's what the Americans do. The Americans, after thalidomide, decided the Americans said, we will never, ever have another thalidomide. We will create hurdles of proof and safety, we will never have another thalidomide. We haven't really had another thalidomide. But the thalidomide story is, any of you know what I'm talking about? You've heard of thalidomide, okay. Right. So the Americans are so proud. They say, our system, we never had a single case of thalidomide because we waited 3 years to see what happened in Europe. And then when we realized you guys were having these babies with short limbs, we stopped. When you look at what we did in Europe, at the same time, we discovered beta blockers for hypertension. The Americans delayed bringing in beta blockers for hypertension because they wanted to be sure they were super safe and they didn't cause thalidomide. In those 3 years, 800,000 Americans died because they didn't get beta blockers. So there's always a payoff between safety and efficacy. And if you want a health system where you can never come into any harm from anything that's sold, you don't have any medicines. And so it's got to be a balance. And I would just argue that the balance in favor of cannabis is quite strong. Historically, we know it works. These mothers have already shown it works. Why would you want to deny them? Well, their kids would die if you denied them access now, their kids would die. You're not going to do that. What we should be doing is we should be learning from the experience we've had previously with cannabis and recent experience in other countries, and making sure that what we do with cannabis is done optimally, and also we must monitor the outcome. So I think there's another way of doing research, which is to let clinicians, physicians, explore forms of cannabis which are safe in the terms that they are what they say they are. They're manufactured to a standard which is relatively consistent. The product has concentrations that you expect. And let's just find out how useful it is rather than wait for pharmaceutical companies to do very expensive studies and end up with drugs which are so expensive the NHS will never buy them anyway. So we have to do it differently.
So as you mentioned, it's really difficult to do research about drugs, principally because it's really slow and also it's really, it's really expensive. So, unfortunately, not just to know the medical use of the different drugs, also in terms to try to have the proper knowledge to do proper harm reduction. Unfortunately, we need to wait many years until you have the ethical approval to do clinical trials. So in the last years, some groups are doing observational studies or are trying, also we are working, for example, in trying to do approach to the drug forums or trying to have like an open study, but obviously it's not the most accurate setting. So do you recommend or do you have any thoughts about which kind of methodology could be useful to do research about drugs nowadays?
I think we should use all forms of methodology. I mean, so one of the things we're doing, so we've done a trial, 20 subjects with psilocybin for depression. It took us 3 years. We've now started another study. It'll take us another 3 years. If we plod along at that rate, I'll be long gone before I'm even confident it works in depression. So what we're doing now is we're utilizing the internet so we can collect information from people who are in effect self-medicating. So there's quite a number of people who are going to healing events, as you might call them. They go to see shamans in Brazil or Mexico or Peru. They go to psilocybin weekend retreats in the Netherlands or in Britain or in Spain. And we're trying to encourage those people to fill out questionnaires before they go and afterwards. And some of them are going specifically for therapy, so they will score moderately on ratings, for instance, of depression. So we're very much trying to collect that information. But also through the Global Drug Survey, we're also trying to collect information on other benefits of drugs. So, for instance, we know that magic mushrooms are powerful treatments for the most painful headaches of all, called cluster headaches which are so devastating that 15% of people who get cluster headaches commit suicide. There will never be a trial of psilocybin cluster headaches because no company will ever make money out of it. So, but if we can collect information through the web, the people using them, we can potentially then direct others who are suffering like that to the right kinds of treatments.
Yes, I just wanted to ask on the question of drugs policy that, basically we're still basing drugs policy in the UK on the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971.
That's right. Yeah.
And we haven't changed much. The classification system, it's changed and then it's gone back to what it was, etc.
Nothing changed except cannabis went down and came up. Everything else has gone up.
Exactly, it's just stayed exactly as it is. And the basis of the government's attitude towards drugs, I think you've described the pressures on it from both the states, but also from pharmaceutical companies, people's concern that they're not being hard on drugs and all this kind of nonsense. But how are we actually going to move this debate forward? Because what is actually being said at the present time is that although the government is recognizing that, looking at harm and risk and things like this, but basically they still have this attitude of abstention, that's really where they want to push people, and that is just not a realistic outcome.
The only way to really change it is to remove policy decisions from politicians. It's the only way. That's not actually even outrageous. We did it, actually Gordon Brown did it. Gordon Brown removed decision-making on interest rates from politicians because he knew politicians were screwing our economy. So he gave it to the Bank of England. So, and that, it hasn't solved our problems, but at least it stopped politicians messing with interest rates. So we should do the same. We should just set up an expert committee that makes decisions about the drug laws, and politicians go and argue about other things that they want to argue about. I don't know. That's the problem. They haven't got much left to argue about. Before Brexit, it was drugs. That's the only benefit of Brexit, is at least they're not going on about drugs as much as they did before. Yeah.
As I said when you kindly signed my book, I'm a nurse. I see a lot of patients who come through our accident emergency department, and they tend to, if they have a mental disorder and they drink or they do drugs, they're kind of given an on-the-spot diagnosis of drug-induced mental disorder, alcohol-induced mental disorder. Do you think there's, from a research perspective, considering how many people self-medicate because of existing mental health conditions, is there any easy answer to the problem of dual diagnosis?
Yeah, well, there's no easy answer, no. But I'm glad you recognize it. Because a lot of people don't. A lot of people choose not to recognize the fact that so much more than... I mean, there was an interesting survey done by one of the alcohol charities just before Christmas. They estimated 60% of all dependent drinkers are self-medicating for some other disorder. So it's a bigger cause of alcoholism than people just being dependent on alcohol. And the same is so similar for so many other drug users are also self-medicating. And we don't recognize that. We want to blame them rather than treat them. But worse than that, we don't even have facilities to treat them anymore, because one of the nastiest things that the Cameron government did was to remove drug addiction from medicine. Because it was a very expensive part of medicine, so they put it into social services and half the budget. And at a stroke, it made things cheaper, but it also meant that there aren't, services for the most complicated and difficult drug users are pretty much non-existent. So where are they? Well, they're seeing you in A&E, or they're in prison. Much more expensive way of dealing with drug problems than actually treating them through, the appropriate traditional medical routes. So again, this moralizing about drugs is not just wrong in terms of reducing harm, it's also wrong in terms of how you help people who've got into trouble with drugs and who become dependent. If they're dependent, you can't just say stop using, because they can't. They're dependent. You have to treat them, you have to help them. But we're struggling to do that, particularly those where they've got a complicated mental illness as well as drug use.
Do you not think that part of the issue, though, is also austerity? Because we've kind of cut back with the hospitals. So we're saying, this person's came in, we think they've got some sort of spice psychosis, and we're not even actually identifying what type of synthetic cannabinoid they're on. So, we're saying that we can't do any research with any of these compounds, but in actual fact, we could be sending off those blood samples, those urine samples, those oral fluid samples away to actually find out what that person was on. And we just don't, because there's not a budget.
Absolutely, that's right. This is this myth that if you are punitive enough, people will stop using, and that's all. It's the old adage. If you're a prohibitionist, you're like a hammer, and everything's a nail. You don't care about learning. You don't care about finding out what's going on. You don't care about testing, because you don't need to. In the end, if you keep hitting people hard enough as a hammer, they'll stop using. I mean, it's absurd and ridiculous, but actually, so people seem to like it somehow. I don't know. I think it's because we as a nation, I think the people that run this country, they have quite a sadistic streak to a lot of them as well. I think they quite enjoy seeing people suffer. Even they know it's not working, but they don't really care because it's not them being affected.
If you look at the drugs which are causing the most harm from a population level, you've got alcohol and prescription drugs in the UK like benzodiazepines, and in the US you've got opioids and alcohol. Where's the leadership from organizations like Public Health England and NICE on an evidence-informed policy to tackle and address these issues?
Well, Public Health England are doing a very good job on tobacco, which is still the largest cause of premature death, and they really are pioneering and championing the use of alternatives to tobacco. And they're getting a lot of flack from it. They're getting a huge amount of flack because, particularly in America, the Americans are still pursuing the prohibitionist approach on tobacco. And they don't like vaping because even though vaping is less harmful than smoking, they still see it as a bad thing. And they know they can't stop smoking because the tobacco companies have negotiated lawsuits with the states which stop them being sued, but they can stop vaping. So Public Health England has been vilified for being a harm reduction on nicotine. In America, they're not allowed. The FDA don't accept the concept of harm reduction for tobacco. So Public Health England is very good on tobacco. Alcohol is more challenging. The alcohol industry is way more sophisticated than the tobacco industry in terms of it's the most sophisticated lobbying organization, probably with the possible exception of the defense industry. And they have twisted politicians. Well, do you know how much it costs to stop a politician voting for a change in the alcohol laws? Well, the way it works is this, is that the most popular club in Parliament is the beer club. Over 60% of all politicians sign up to the beer club. What do you get if you sign up to the beer club in Parliament? You get 2 cases of nice beer at Christmas. 200 quid. The receipt of those means that those politicians will never will never support any law that encourages changes in drinking behavior, changes in licensing laws, etc. So our politicians are effectively corrupted by the drinks industry to a point they don't know they are, but they are, and that is actually the biggest challenge. The drinks industry is extremely good at buying people, and they buy politicians. The way they buy politicians is also not just through the beer club. They do it very cleverly because they're no longer able to directly give money or booze to politicians apart from at Christmas. But they do 2 things. They massively fund the hospitality industry, and the hospitality industry takes politicians out on very nice trips to foreign places to see how it can bring more Englishness to Ceylon or Madagascar and places like that. And also every fortnight there's a free drinks party in Parliament. And politicians drink with editors of newspapers, completely free from 4 to 8. They can just drink whatever they like, and it's all paid for by the drinks companies. And that way they just keep the drinks industry out of reach of politicians.
I noticed on the psilocybin study there was there was a lot of people that had a very notable effect. How do you control for placebo in that scenario? Because obviously we know that the more dramatic the intervention, the greater the placebo effect. Especially when you're saying that some of those people had no reaction to 10 or more treatments.
That's a really good question, and in fact, it's really one of the great challenges is how you do appropriate placebo in these kind of experiments. And the answer is it's just very difficult. So what is happening now to get psilocybin is going through this multi-centered trial, and in order to comply with the regulatory insistence that there must be a kind of placebo and some dose effect, that the company that's doing the study, it's called Compassion Pathways, is doing a really low dose, 1 milligram, which doesn't do anything, a microdose, a moderate dose, 10 milligrams, and a high dose, 25. So the expectation or the hope is that they will see there's a dose-response relationship, but everyone gets the drug, so everyone gets all the therapy around the drug. How do you control for big effects in the brain, which might be enough to give you a big placebo effect? So people have tried that. I mean, one of the end-of-life studies, they gave niacin, which makes you flush. So people had a big flushing effect, so they knew they had something. The Johns Hopkins study gave people methylphenidate Ritalin, so they had a kind of bit of a brain buzz. Neither of those were as good as the active ingredient. But then, of course, another way of thinking about it is that maybe this big effect on the brain is actually useful. And we believe that. We believe the people that do best with psilocybin are the ones who do have powerful, major alterations in consciousness to the point where they actually probably disrupt the ongoing model brain systems which underpin depression, for instance. And that's probably why it works, because it actually disrupts what's going on and allows your brain to kind of settle down into a slightly different way of thinking.
Okay, we have time for 2 more, so if you could be super polite, and if you see someone who's had their hand up for longer than you, put your hand down, that would be lovely, okay? I'll take one from here and one from here. Don't all put your hands down, that's too polite.
Hi. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but you showed this graph of the study you did for the Norwegian people where you were, I think it was cannabis you were investigating, and you showed this plot of how regulated cannabis was, how good it was depending on how regulated cannabis was. And I was just wondering how did you get this data? Did you actually look at other countries, or did you simulate it, or how did you?
I'm sorry, which graph?
You showed this graph showing how regulated cannabis was compared to.
The comparative harms.
Yeah. And I was just wondering how do you come up with this data and without?
That data is it's an assessment of the relative harms of the different drugs. In our case, 20 different drugs on the 16 different parameters. So you've got this very large matrix of harms of all these different drugs on these 16 different parameters, and it's done by each. It's complicated, but because the measures in each are different. So the measures of lethality, the likelihood of dying, from which is one of the measures, is obviously a different measure from the economic costs of chronic illness. So what you do is you use a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, which allows you to estimate or compare magnitudes of effects or harms, in this case, across different dimensions which don't have the same metrics. And that's what we did. And that's why cannabis came out lower than tobacco and much lower than alcohol. What we also then did was we actually got funding from the DG Justice in Europe to replicate that study, repeat that study using European experts. And it was a remarkable study. We took 30 European experts, 20 European different countries. They changed every one of the scalings. They changed every one of the weightings. And the final result was so similar that you couldn't tell the difference, 0.995 correlation between the UK and Europe. And that kind of proves that this process is extraordinarily solid in terms of estimating comparative harms.
Okay, last one this side.
Thank you. So as an American here, which I understand has been rightfully the villain a lot of tonight's talk.
Well, you're lucky you've left.
Yeah, I have left, yes, at least for now. We are in the odd position, though, despite the fact that marijuana is now, or cannabis formerly, is now illegal across the country. We have presidential candidates who have admitted not just to smoking marijuana, but also inhaling even now.
Yeah.
And one hopes that this kind of openness about usage might help to support slow legislative change. In the same way that you were hoping that your facts that you've been sharing with us might help as well tonight. One thing I've been surprised by, though, is that over here at least, I know our current Prime Minister has never done anything naughtier than running around a field of wheat, but I haven't heard the same degree of openness about drug usage. I mean, you say millions of people doing these things every weekend, but I haven't seen it in the public discourse. And I wonder if there's a difference there in legality. Like, I'm reminded of the grandmother you mentioned, or the 50-year-old woman who was getting her door knocked down. Would talking about drug usage, especially illicit drug usage, open you up to some probable cause for a search to find if you were committing a possession crime? I know you're not a lawyer, but I recall seeing an article where you mentioned that in your research on Alcarel, perhaps it was, some amount of tasting or trying was necessary, if I remember correctly. I don't recall exactly.
Right, yeah.
Is there a reason why there seems to be less discourse around illegal drug usage?
Oh yeah, it's called the Daily Mail. It's very interesting though. So, when did you come from America?
When?
When?
3.5 years ago.
Yeah, so a long time ago, before you were born, there was an attempt by the Tory party they had a Home Secretary who decided that she wanted to get even harder on cannabis. And wanted to start imprisoning people for cannabis use in the same way as some states in America do. And the good thing was that half of the Tory front bench said, you cannot do this because we smoke cannabis at college. So that was the only time there's been a kind of consensus, or at least a group of politicians that actually stood up and actually shared, and that was to stop us becoming even more oppressive in terms of cannabis. But it is difficult because there's such a huge media outcry. So I mean, I don't know if you hopefully none of you read the Daily Mail, but they are attacking. There's a desperate attempt now to roll back the threat of recreational cannabis here. You know, they've kind of conceded we're going to have medical cannabis, but they're making it very hard to make it available. But they're absolutely determined to create more and more hysteria about recreational cannabis. So that is the new line. That is a new red line in the drug laws, not to allow people to have recreational cannabis in Britain. And that's going to be a very, very vicious battle. And a lot of it's going to be centered around psychosis and schizophrenia. The point is, we wouldn't have that problem if we did have the safest forms of cannabis available. So it's a kind of bizarre argument. You fight a battle that was inevitably going to make things worse. Maybe that's a good point to end, because you're going to be fighting that battle a lot longer than I am, because you're all much younger than me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.